there. Today, we will be starting Unit 1, Part 1, looking at the cell and talking about the difference between living and non-living things. So today, that's where we're going to start, looking at the difference between living and non-living things, finding out what does it really mean to be alive and how we can distinguish between things that are alive and things that are non-living. So first, there are two categories that all things can fall under. They can either be a living thing, meaning that it's alive, or they are considered non-living, meaning that they are not alive and were never alive. They're a non-living thing. Now, the way that we are going to do this is to learn about the 6 characteristics of living things. You will then be able to use those characteristics to determine whether something is living or non-living. Now, before we move on to talk about those characteristics, I want you to pause, maybe look at the pictures on the screen, and try to sit down and create a list of things that you think are true of living things. Try to make your own list of characteristics before we move on. Go ahead, pause the video, and start your list. So think about the list that you came up with. Maybe you said things like moving, or eating, or breathing. Now we're going to look at what are the 6 characteristics that must be true of something for it to be considered living. So as I mentioned, there are 6 characteristics. All living things, every living thing, possesses all of these 6 characteristics. That means that if something does not possess all 6 of these characteristics, it cannot be considered living. So let's look at what those characteristics are. The first is cells. In order for something to be considered a living thing, it must be made up of cells. We're going to look much more deeply into cells as we continue in this unit, but now all you need to know is that in order for something to be considered living, it must be made up of cells. That also means that if something is not made of cells, it tells us it is not living. The second characteristic that must be true for something to be living is reproduction. This means that that living thing can produce offspring or smaller versions of itself, okay? There are also several different methods of reproduction, which we again will look at later in the unit. But now all you need to know is that if something is living, it can reproduce or can create more of its own organism. The third characteristic is growth and development. Growth, meaning what we already know growth to be, starting very, very small in terms of size and getting larger. However, some organisms stay very, very small and don't really show any clear evidence of growth. So we also say development there, meaning starting sort of more simply and becoming more mature or changing in some way. The fourth characteristic is response to environment. So that means that if I am a living thing, I am able to respond to things that take place in my environment. If you look at the pictures, there's an example there that I will explain to have this characteristic make a little more sense. If you look at the flower here with the flashlight, you'll see that flowers actually, and all plants actually have the ability to change their pattern of growth or the direction that they face in order to face the light. Again, we will talk more about why plants need light, but that is an example of a response to the environment. Living things need to be able to do this, and there's one example of an organism doing it. The fifth characteristic of all living things is the ability to use energy. As you probably know about living things do a lot of different functions. Think about yourself. In order for those things to happen, they need to utilize energy. That energy comes from our food, and again, we will talk about it in more detail as we go through this unit, but if it is a living thing, it must use energy. And the sixth and final characteristic of all living things is the ability to adapt. This simply means that a living thing can make adjustments or changes to things that happen in their environment. So wrapping up today, you now know the 6 characteristics of living things. You also know that for something to be considered living, it must possess all 6 of these characteristics. And a way to determine a living thing from a non-living thing is to see or analyze whether they possess all of these characteristics. And you know, if they do not, that thing is considered non living.